Representative Sampson, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a number of questions through you for the proponent, but before I begin, I just want to state for the record that as it was pointed out already by the minority leader and also the esteemed ranking member of the Transportation Committee, we received this bill maybe an hour or so before the debate has begun. And so I'm more or less prepared to debate about half of the bill. It's, I think, 196 lines, and I'm up to around line 97. So hopefully as we go, maybe I can learn a little bit more about what's contained therein. So with that, question through you, Mr. Speaker, to the proponent of the bill.
Please proceed, sir.
The first section talks about primary proof of identity. And it was already pointed out that what items were required. I would just like a little more clarification about what these two items that are listed in lines 10 and 11, consular identification document, and also in line 11, consular report. I'm wondering if the proponent of the bill could describe for me exactly what these documents are and what they do. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. The consulate identification will be consulates from foreign countries that are located within the United States. They actually are there to assist residents from foreign countries with passport issues or any other documentation that or transactions that they need to go back and forth with their home country. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm to understand that these are documents that assist residents of foreign nations to go to and fro their home country. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, not specifically to go to their country, assuming that they came with a valid visa. They will use a passport. But this is an identification that is issued by the consulate who verifies the individual identity through a system that is connected to their vital statistics office in their home country. To you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I guess I want to expound upon the discussion that you had with the minority leader about whether or not this is truly, as indicated in line 5, proof of identity. My feeling is that it's kind of tough to call this proof because we're talking about documents that are from a foreign nation that we don't have any way to go back and verify. And I'm not quite certain that we had a proper definition of what a consular identification document is or a consular report. Forgive me, I'm not familiar with these documents and I'm not particularly satisfied with the answer. But I'll move on to ask you about line number 8, where it says that we are going to accept a valid foreign passport, which I don't know how we're going to determine that it's valid, but that is either unexpired or one that is expired for less than 3 years. And my question through you, Mr. Speaker, is what do we do about people that have a expired passport that is been expired for more than 3 years? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that will be a passport that the Department of Motor Vehicle will not accept as a valid form of identity. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my understanding that the purpose of this bill is to help folks that may not be in the state of Connecticut legally obtain a motor vehicle operator's license. But it seems to me that if we are going to include this requirement for a valid foreign passport, unexpired or expired for less than 3 years, we are excluding a significant number of folks that would otherwise be eligible. Through you, Mr. Speaker, can you tell me roughly how many people we are talking about that might be included versus excluded based on that definition?
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that's very hard to determine. I don't have an answer for the gentleman. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just wondering if we are so concerned about taking care of folks that are in this situation, why we would make a distinction about whether or not they were here for 5 minutes, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatsoever. And I'm wondering what the reason that this was included in the bill. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Well, this is included in the bill because we need to identify that there needs to be a document in front of us that identifies the individual, although we're not issuing a driver's license that can be used as identification. We're basically accepting these documents presented by the individual, just stating that they are who they are. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, hard for me to understand that this is proof. In my mind, proof that we would accept for most things, certainly as state agencies, to issue licenses, might be fingerprints, might be some type of documentation that we can truly rely on. I don't know how many total nations there are on the planet. Some that we might have folks that come to and from America on a regular basis, but there might be some foreign lands that might have very strange documents that no one's familiar with. Yet we are going to be asked to rely on these documents, and it strikes me as a tough thing to call proof. In the second section, when we talk about the secondary proof of identity, just reading through it, I noticed that the line 20 includes a baptismal certificate. I don't really know what to say about that, other than I think, again, that's something that's awful hard to consider proof. And then in line 22, when we talk about, again, proof of residency, one of the documents listed is electronic mail. Through you, Mr. Speaker, how does electronic mail translate into proof of residency? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. Give me 1 second. Through you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the, through you, Mr. Speaker, thank you for the gentleman's patience. When it comes to the baptismal certificate, it's something that's currently an accepted form of identification that is part of the document checklist for identification verification that DMV currently accepts. And for the electronic mail will be an electronic bill that may be sent to the individual, like an electronic, if you go to your website and you play your utility bill, you go to the website, it gives you an electronic piece of document that states your name and address within that document. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lines 22 and lines 23 say, means a piece of mail or electronic mail that includes an applicant's name and address, indicates that such applicant resides in the state and is dated. Not before 90 days before the application. I don't understand how an email that you receive as any indication or as indicated proof of residency. If I could get some understanding of how an email translates to proof of residency. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. Electronic mail, meaning, like I said it earlier, a utility bill, for example, will have the individual's name, will have the individual's address, and will have a date when the bill is due, when the bill was generated. So you'll have certain features within that bill, always electronically, that prove the individual's residency. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rather than continue to beat a dead horse, I'll just go on. But I'm looking through this entire section about proof of residency, and I noticed that there are certain things listed. One of them says a motor vehicle insurance card. Through you, Mr. Speaker, explain to me why someone would have a motor vehicle insurance card if they don't have a car or a license beforehand. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that's currently part of the requirements that DMV has in their official document checklist. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm understanding that the items that are listed in this section, proof of residency, are something that motor vehicle already accepts. But of course, you know, they came up with this list of things that they accept because they're dealing with people that live here and are citizens of the United States. And I think there's very little question about their citizenship when they're able to provide the other documents that they would require, like a birth certificate and so forth. This is an entirely different and new situation where we have none of that documentation and we have very little information to verify someone's identity. And between you and me, Mr. Speaker, looking at the requirements for sections 1, 2, and 3 for the primary proof of identity, secondary proof of identity, and the proof of residency, I don't think that if I had these documents, I could get a fishing license, let alone a driver's license. Yet we are going to go forward without really being able to verify someone's identity in any way, shape, or form because we have no fingerprints. We have limited documents from their country of origin that cannot be validated in any way. To me, it's a scary thought. Continuing on. In section B1, starting line 45, it says that the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles shall not decline to issue a license to an applicant who meets all of the requirements that are contained in the current law, except that they cannot provide proof that they are legally present in the United States. Does this mean that it applies specifically to people that are not legally present in the United States? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the gentleman is correct.
Representative Sampson.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, can I ask what the fee is going to be for this particular driver's license that is given out in this manner? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, it will be the driving permit is. Okay. Driver's license fee is $80, and this will be the same fee that we all pay currently. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I looked through section B, lines 45 through 60, and I don't see anything that makes a determination about the appearance of this particular driver's license that will result from this becoming law. Through you, Mr. Speaker, is there any specific difference in appearance, writing, shape, size, color that would distinguish one of these particular driver's licenses from the kind that the folks in this chamber might have? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the driver's license will show those that do not meet the Real ID Act. It will distinguish in the face of the driver's license that it cannot be something of this nature. It cannot be used for federal identification purposes. And also, it will state, they will have a restriction on the driver's license, and that restriction will state that is for driving purposes only. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, outside of the addition of the language, which, as you stated, is for driving purposes only, it's going to look exactly like a regular driver's license. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the gentleman is correct. Besides language, I think that the purpose is not to bombard the Department of Motor Vehicles with issuing significantly different driver's licenses. I don't think that we're here in the purpose of identifying a criminal. We're actually issuing a driver's license to an individual for driving purposes. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria. I'm sorry, excuse me. Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seeing how we're talking about the new license is going to say for driving purposes only on it, let me ask the question. Can this driver's license be used for any other purpose? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, can the good gentleman define those purposes?
Well, I think it's a pretty simple question. It says in line 90 that this license is to be used for driving purposes only. So that, to me, would preclude any other purpose. So through you, Mr. Speaker, can the driver's license be used for any other purpose?
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the only purpose that the driver's license will be issued is for driving purposes only. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just like a little bit, tiny bit more affirmation that it cannot be used for anything besides driving purposes only, as the bill states. And it seemed to me that you purposely left some wiggle room in there to say that that's what it says, but not what it does. Through Mr. Speaker, can the driver's license be used for anything besides for driving purposes only, as it's stated in quotes on line 90?
Representative Candelaria, I believe you've answered this question, but if you choose to answer it again.
I'll be glad to answer the good gentleman's question. Through you, Mr. Speaker. The driver's license is, as it states in the language, for driving purposes only. Now, with that said, I cannot respond what other institutions or entities will do with this driver's license. Our goal here is to issue a driver's license for driving purposes only. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, and thank you to Representative Candelaria, because I believe he's very perceptive in what I'm driving at, and that is that I think that once you issue this driver's license, there is the potential that it can be used for many other purposes, not the least of which is to buy liquor or cigarettes, to enter a bar. And yet we have, as we established in our previous discussion about proof of residency, proof of identity, and so forth, very little in the way of documentation to truly verify what the age of someone might be. So I think that by itself is a concern. I want to ask about line 61 through 63, which says that the commissioner shall not issue a motor vehicle's operator's license under this section to any applicant who has been convicted of any felony in Connecticut. And I know that we've already gone through this with the minority leader, who very aptly pointed out that it doesn't preclude someone who has a felony in another state, or multiple felonies in another state, or a felony in one state and maybe another felony in another state, or multiple felonies in multiple other states, from being able to obtain a license. But does it include any method outside of what is indicated in the following section about the internet website of the Judicial Department to determine whether or not someone has committed a felony? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, to answer the gentleman's question, no, it's only what's stated within the language of the bill, but understanding that these individuals will have some type of common sense and understand, although they may speak other languages, but they understand our laws. These individuals know that if they have any type of felony, there might be the possibilities that they can be deported. So through you, Mr. Speaker, based on what we have on the language of the bill, the gentleman is correct. There's nothing else. It will be what the Department of Motor Vehicles will determine based on the Judicial Branch website. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess what I would say to that response is that one of our concerns as legislators ought to be the safety of our citizens. And it strikes me that if we're going to be giving the privilege of operating a motor vehicle to folks that we cannot verify their driving history because they come from another country, and we are overtly allowing folks that have committed acts of crime in other states by the language in this bill, are we in some way shirking our duty to be responsible to the citizens of our state? It doesn't seem to make any sense to me that we would say that knowingly, and we've already established, it says in the bill, you could have a felony in multiple other states, and we're still going to give you a driver's license in Connecticut. Through you, Mr. Speaker, is there any way to determine if someone has a bad driving record in another country? Through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, not that I'm aware of.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with regard to the knowledge test that is indicated in line 64, does this test already exist? Through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, yes.
Representative Sampson.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, can you tell me in what languages it's produced? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm not quite sure. I am sure that the test can be taken in Spanish. That much I know. I don't know if there's other languages that you can take the test in. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I would assume that this legislation would apply to immigrants regardless of where they're coming from. And, of course, there's a multitude of languages across the planet. And I know that there is something in existing statute about requiring someone who takes the test to speak a language that at least 1% of the population of Connecticut speaks. And I'm wondering if that still applies for one of these particular licenses. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if that's the current language in statutes, then the answer will be you're correct.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, are there any countries that we would refuse to accept their documents as proof of identity? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I don't think there's anything specified in the bill what documents, but it gives the discretion to the Commissioner of Motor Vehicle what documents to accept. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not finding in the language where it says that the Commissioner has discretion over what should be acceptable proof of identity other than what is specified in sections 1, 2, and 3 that we already talked about. Is there some discretion that the Commissioner has to say that this particular document looks fraudulent or he will not accept? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I believe that lines 44 through approximately 48 establishes that in the interpretation. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe the section that you're referring to talks about the existing law about requirements that the Department of Motor Vehicles requires to give someone a license. And I've read through it, and I'm quite certain there is nothing that gives discretion to the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles. It's very explicit about what is required. But what I'm asking is about the documents that are mentioned in sections 1 and 2, which are not mentioned in the existing law because these are foreign documents that we're talking about that are now going to be used for proof of identity. I'm wondering what method will be used to determine whether they are valid and whether the Commissioner has the discretion to determine which documents are valid. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I believe to answer that question in a broader sense, I think those countries that the United States does not do business with and have restrictions with will be an obvious documents that the Commission would not accept. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And forgive me, I did not hear the response. I had someone talking in my ear. If you mind repeating it.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria, would you mind repeating the answer?
I'll repeat it only for a fee. Through you, Mr. Speaker. My assumption is the United States of America has certain restrictions with foreign countries. And we could talk about foreign policy and all that, but I think that's what we're talking about now, where we have certain restrictions. It would be my assumption that the Commissioner would follow those restrictions. So if we do not have an agreement with a specific foreign country, we would not accept those documentations. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria. I'm sorry, excuse me, Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I bring this all up because I think that there are some countries where we could look at the documents and very clearly determine whether or not they are valid, because it might be something that is well known, because there are many folks immigrating from those countries, or they happen to speak English there, or they use similar methods of security that we're familiar with. But there's also countries that I believe probably produce documents that would be easily forged, and there would be very, very little effort in going through the trouble to produce a forgery. And it's just a concern I have. I think a lot of my concerns that I brought up tonight have to do with what real effort we're going through to preserve public safety. There is no question that in the United States we have a significant problem with immigration. This country was founded on the concept that we are a melting pot and that we want people to come here. The thing is that there is legal immigration and there is illegal immigration. And I'd be the first person to point out that the legal immigration system that we have in this country is lacking, to say the least. It's broken, and it needs to be corrected. It needs to be repaired. The thing is that is something that needs to happen on a federal level. We do not have the power to change immigration law in this body. All we can do is find a way to work with what we have. And I'm afraid that what we're doing with this bill is blurring the lines between what's legal immigration and what's illegal immigration. What I would like to see happen is for us to fix the legal immigration system so that people who are going about things the right way will be rewarded, and people that are going about things in the wrong way will not. And I'm afraid that that's what happens in this bill, is that we are unfairly rewarding folks that don't necessarily deserve it because they have not gone about the process the right way. Now, there is probably many people that have gone through the effort the right way that would be affected by this as well, but we don't have a way of determining that. And maybe that's the ultimate problem. We don't have a way of determining whether or not the folks that are in this country were criminals in their former country. We don't even have the ability, based on this, to determine whether or not they are criminals in another state. And in fact, as was pointed out, they could in fact be criminals in another state, and they would still be welcome to get a driver's license in Connecticut based on the bill before us. I think that this bill encourages illegal immigration. Basically, it is a seal of approval once you get this driver's license. Mr. Speaker, through you to the proponent of the bill, can someone who is not a legal resident of the United States or Connecticut drive currently? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if they're legal residents, yes, they can.
Representative Sampson.
I don't know if we said legal or illegal. I was specifying illegal resident, someone who's not supposed to be in the country. Can they drive legally if they are not a legal resident? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, based on Connecticut's current regulations and law, no.
Representative Sampson.
Is there anything prohibiting someone from obtaining insurance who is not a legal resident of the state? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, not to my knowledge.
Representative Sampson.
Okay. I think we all know that if you are a legal resident, even if you are from a foreign country, that you can certainly drive here. I believe that all that's required is that you need to have the driver's license from your home country and a translation with it. And, of course, you'd need to be driving a legally registered car that would have to have insurance on it. I guess what I'm driving at is that I'm wondering if this even makes any difference. When this bill was bouncing around at the beginning of the session, some folks came to see me to tell me about why this would be a good idea. And one of the things that they did was they brought a couple of individuals into my office to explain to me what their individual concerns were. And one of them was a woman who had been involved in a motor vehicle accident in New Haven, and she had been hit by an illegal alien who was driving illegally. And, you know, we talked for a little bit, but it turned out that at the end of the day, her real concern was that the person had no insurance. Now, I understand that once we provide licenses to individuals, that might make them more inclined to go out and obtain a proper registration and insurance. But I don't see that there's any guarantee of that happening. Through you, Mr. Speaker, is there any evidence to suggest that once you allow someone who is perfectly willing to drive illegally a license, that they're more inclined to obtain insurance? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, based on other states, specifically the state of California, people that have a driver's license or can obtain a driver's license will go and secure motor vehicle insurance as well. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for his answers. I guess that's a question that I don't really know the answer to. I don't see that having a driver's license makes anyone more inclined to obtain insurance. And if someone was willing to drive illegally to begin with, they'd probably be willing to drive with or without a driver's license or with or without insurance. So I don't know if that lady's concerns would be addressed in any way. There was a second person that came in also, and he was a very nice gentleman of Hispanic origin, but he is a American citizen, and he expressed concerns about being profiled, and that he would be pulled over inside the city of New Haven on a regular basis by police suspecting that he was somehow driving illegally. And we talked for a bit about that too. And I asked him a very simple question, and that was, if there were fewer illegal immigrants driving illegally in town, do you think that that would stop the police from stopping you? And he had no choice but to say yes, because he realized at that point that the police were merely used to a certain characteristic, which is Hispanic males in New Haven driving illegally. And granted, most of them are not, but that's something that, because it's a problem, they try and address it. Some would say that's profiling. I don't know if it is or not. I'm not here to cast judgment on that process or how it happens. What I'm trying to say is that I think that it is a result of the behavior that continues, and I believe that this bill is only going to increase, because while you're going to have more and more people obtaining driver's licenses legally, I think we've already established you're going to be attracting more folks to Connecticut who may have questionable background because of their driving history in other states, and the fact that Connecticut is the place where you can obtain a driver's license. The thing is, I want to reward people for doing the right thing. So many people have taken tremendous effort to get to this country and have followed the rules. And I'm afraid that sometimes we are willing, because we have compassion for people, to ignore the rules that they have broken. The problem with that is that we are putting them ahead of folks that followed the rules, even if it was difficult. People that have left the country when their visa was about to expire, even though maybe they were at the crux of something so important in their life. Mr. Speaker, I just want to ask for a roll call vote on the amendment as I wrap up.
Gentleman has asked for a roll call vote on House Amendment A. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Necessary 20% has been met. When we vote on House Amendment A, we will do so by roll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple more comments.
Please hold the floor, sir.
I'd like to just say in closing that more than anything else, I think what we need to be aware of is the unintended consequences of this bill. I believe that there could be a tremendous cost on our society. We already know that illegal immigration costs our state a great deal. I have an article in front of me from 2010 where it was estimated that $259 million was the cost to the state of Connecticut, which, considering the deficit that we had at the time, is not an insignificant number. People will say that illegal immigrants pay taxes, and that is true. They certainly do pay certain sales taxes, but they don't pay property taxes, and they do not pay federal or state income taxes, and yet are often the source of expenses that the state has to bear. I point out the hospitals. During the budget situation, we're constantly being reminded that there are cuts that are being proposed that affect hospitals in nearly all of our communities. And I'm afraid that increasing the amount of legal immigration coming into Connecticut is going to increase the burden on the hospitals in our state as well. That's just one potential unintended consequence. We could talk about terrorism. There are people that are a danger to the citizens of this country. The fact is that 99% of folks are going to be decent, law-abiding citizens who will do the right thing. But what about the folks that would abuse this situation to come here to be among us and potentially commit acts of terrorism? We already talked about the lack of ability to determine someone's true origin or even their age. What about people that would use this purely to lie about their age so that they could obtain liquor? And what about other states? What are the consequences to other states when our residents who are not legal immigrants drive to another state using a Connecticut driver's license that they obtain here? I don't know if those licenses will be recognized or not. So when everyone gets a chance to vote tonight, I hope that they take a moment to think about whether or not we should be rewarding people that have not gone about the process the right way versus people that have. And also think about the safety of our citizens and the unintended consequences that this legislation might bring. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, sir. You carried your remark.